I remember being told that I'd had a stroke, but they termed it a massive stroke, and I believe all the right-hand side of my head was affected. To me, stroke happened to old people, not knowing I was one of them. I can remember friends of my grandmother's having stroke and unfortunately dying within weeks of having a stroke. So I thought, my God, am I on the way out? Immediately after having a stroke, the physical effects were the inability to walk. I wasn't allowed to walk from my bed to go to the toilet. I had to be walked by a delightful nurse. That's a bit embarrassing. The rehab people were good. They'd give you a target, and I like having targets, and I like beating targets. So that helped me with my rehab, I think, just doing a little bit more and being pushed. When I got home, I was terribly cranky, but I was very depressed, and I think that manifested itself by total lack of interest in everything, and a feeling of incredible sadness, and a feeling of non-compassion. I used to read stories in the paper, and they'd really get to you, and you feel, gee, that was sad, And then I'd read other stories, and since subsequent to stroke, and they wouldn't affect me. And I could remember thinking to myself, that should really affect me. I had no idea what to expect after I got out of rehab hospital. I knew I couldn't hold things in my left hand because I would just drop it. And I knew I couldn't see people that were standing on my left, but I got home and my wife would work on that. She would make sure she would come and stand beside me on my left side and make sure I'd notice her. And she used to do little tricks like that, little things to help me with my rehab when I got home. And I credit her to this day the way I am now. I've seen other stroke survivors who haven't progressed anywhere near as well as I have. When you go to the doctor and mention something strange happening to you after a stroke, they'd say, oh, well, that's just a byproduct of the stroke, They'd shrug it off, and I got used to people saying that's a byproduct of the stroke. I didn't have any indication that my emotions would be affected. I wasn't informed in any way that my emotions would be affected that I can recall. I think it would have helped me earlier when I got out of rehab if I was informed that I was likely to have depression. It would have helped me a lot. I thought it was just sadness and part of the stroke. I felt better immediately after the medication. I certainly felt better within myself. To me, depression was just a thing that you just feel a bit down and that's it, but I didn't realise it was so deep. But you find yourself curled up on the bed in a ball, and total lack of motivation and total sadness inside. That's what made me think perhaps I should see. And luckily, I've got a clever wife that directs me where to go. The best thing that happened to me post-stroke was going to the Stroke Foundation's stroke awareness groups. And by going there, it makes you aware that you're not the only person that feels as you do, That helped my depression, if you want to call it, my sadness, or my feeling of total loss. And stroke affects not just the person that it attacks, but it certainly depresses the family. I think perhaps at the time they should have had some emotional support or a bit of backup. Even now I still feel there are days when I still feel a bit sad about what's happened, a bit down, not totally down, but a bit sad about life, and I feel as though I couldn't get happy, I get frustrated now at not being able to do what I used to do. The frustration is still there with stroke, not to the extent that it gets you really depressed, but the frustration is an everyday thing. Anger is still there, not being able to do things. I would suggest to people not to just sit down and feel sorry for themselves as I used to. I read a lot now, I walk a lot, and I believe walking is the answer to a lot of problems. The best antidepressant for me is to have grandkids crawling all over you. That's the greatest antidepressant in the world.
I probably realised that my life had changed immediately. I didn't physically know anyone who'd had a stroke, but I just knew that they were pretty debilitating, or the ones that I knew about. I knew he'd never be the same person. Didn't ever talk about Don to my friends because I just felt disloyal if I did. People would say, "How's Don?" and I'd say, "He's fine, he's fine." I've opened my heart a little bit to my sister, but not a lot. Because then she starts asking me questions, and they're questions I don't always want to answer. More or less, if you want to listen to me, but don't ask me a lot of questions. I don't want a lot of questions. I also think that maybe when I go out for coffee or if I go out for lunch, I want a break. I want it to be me time, not Don time. I feel I've got to get out sometimes. I really feel I've got to get out. And when Don's asleep every afternoon, that's no fun. Because he was such a vibrant, busy man. Not being able to hold a nail and a hammer or see him need to have a sleep, I feel for him. So I don't like seeing him like that. That depresses me. There are times that I feel I'd love to get away by myself, just by myself, and then I get a bit chicken about it all. And then I'd have one part of my foot in up there and one part of my foot down here, wondering how he was, so I can't relax, really. This is the first time.
With the kids too.
Is this the first time we took the kids away? I think I accepted pretty early that life was never going to be the same. I'm not saying I liked it, but I think I accepted it earlier. It's just probably the type of person I am, that I didn't dwell on things. I wasn't looking after myself, probably not, because as I said before, all the energy was going into Don. Every single fibre of my being was going into Don. No, and I still don't think I look after myself. Sometimes I'll sleep for a few hours and then I wake up and I'm awake for a while. I've been up and I've read. I've been up. I asked the doctor. No, I was told the doctor once, and he gave me sleeping tablets. And even on sleeping tablets, I was sitting up here doing Sudoku in the middle of the night and getting them out. But I've had troughs, I feel myself going downhill and then work like hell to bring myself up. And a girlfriend of mine said to me, "I don't know how you do it, you're always upbeat." And she said, "I would curl myself up in a corner if I was you." And I said, "Well, I'm probably like a duck. Underneath I'm swimming like hell, but up top I'm trying to keep this normality about things, I suppose." I rejected counselling earlier on because I was, I don't know, maybe young and foolish or younger and foolish. I always thought I could do things by myself. It took me over 10 years before I would admit, over 11 years before I would admit that I needed help. The issues that we talk about, and poor Don, mainly Don, what his behaviour has been, or how I've been feeling about his behaviour, or and sometimes she tells me, "Oh, you're in a better place this time," or "I'm not in such a good place," and I just feel with her that I can say virtually whatever I want without feeling that I'm being disloyal to Don. I don't take antidepressants. Maybe I should. I don't know. I like to think I don't like taking medication, full stop, which is probably my problem, not anyone else's. But I try to do it by myself and without medication, and therefore I go to a psychologist. She said, now when you go home, she said, I don't want you saying to people, my husband has suffered a stroke. You say, we have suffered a stroke. Makes you think that it's not just the person who's ill. It affects everybody. If Don had his stroke today, I would certainly be in the next few weeks trying to find out what was out there to help us both, not just him, both. I probably would talk more about him with people, friends, or just get things off my chest more rather than keeping them close to my chest. My take on life today is really just one day at a time. It sounds a cliche, doesn't it? But I really don't think about tomorrow. I just wait and get through today.
The day I had the stroke, I was at work. It was in the afternoon and I was sitting down, I was talking to a client on the phone, and apparently I made some strange noises, and then the young woman who was in the office as well came up and asked whether I was all right. I wasn't aware that anything had happened, so I sort of said yes, I was fine. And then she went and got someone else, and apparently they could see my whole right side had dropped. I felt that everything was right, and I couldn't work out why everyone was fussing about. I got to the hospital and they told me, and then once it dawned on me, it totally changed, and I was extremely upset, very crying all the time. And I remember saying to my friend, we're both big bushwalkers, and I remember saying to her, I don't think I'll ever walk again, and that was my biggest fear at that stage. Everybody thought that I made a miraculous recovery, so no one was really aware of there were any serious issues. I went home to Mum and Dad's after the 4 days in hospital, and I stayed there for 3 weeks. Mum could notice that I was really going downhill in the sense of my mobility wasn't very good. I could tell as well that it was like all my nerve ends were switched on all the time. I was very tight on the right side, and I could also tell that that my memory was not good. Everything that I did, the amount of effort that it took in the brain to work out, I was getting so probably frustrated and unable to deal with my emotions. My sister-in-law came up one Sunday afternoon. She actually was the one that really picked up that I wasn't working very well and that I was very teary, and she said to me that she felt that I was going through a bit of a depression. And what we did then, she was great, what we did then was she wrote down what we needed to do. Tomorrow morning, ring my doctor, make an appointment, also ring the counsellor that I had known prior, many years before, to see if I could make an appointment.
Oh, hi Max, it's Tracy. How are you going?
And then I think I started feeling a bit more relieved that things were starting to, I was feeling a bit more in control. When I saw my own doctor, he diagnosed me that I did have, I was having effects of a depression, which was after the stroke. And he really just sort of said to me that most people that go through something like that will have some type of an effect. But he obviously, when you think of it, if he put me on antidepressants straight away, he obviously felt that that was needed. He was good in saying that he felt that I was handling the stroke, having a stroke, very well, and felt that most people would be going through what I would be going through. We sat down and again we wrote down what I needed to do just to protect myself. I had to get up early in the morning, make sure that I got dressed, make sure that I had breakfast, and my little cat had breakfast, and pretty much for the next 6 months, that was pretty much all I did. I lost everything, and so I knew that had happened, and I knew that it was going to be very difficult to get out of it. Also at that stage, with having the stroke, it was like my mind was in a bit of a fog. It dictated what I could say, how I could talk. It also told me when I'd had enough. What was very important, I guess, with the depression was to actually do the sensible, practical things that could help. There is a grieving process, and I think it happens in multi-levels. You go through different emotions. You go through the denial, through the frustration, the anger, and then all of a sudden it hits you. You go through all these different emotions, and those things I really feel someone who's had a stroke needs to go through with the depression to actually come out on top of it. Would have been middle of last year. That was when I stopped fighting it. It's not a matter of going back to my normal self, because that just won't happen. But once you accept it, you're much happier, and you can then make a new life for your own.
remember waking and there was just doctors everywhere and my world was suddenly tilted like a boat and was spinning really fast, and there was two of everything with my new double vision. And no one could understand me, and I could not understand. I couldn't begin to fathom why people couldn't understand what I was saying, because to me it made sense. I've never ever been so scared my whole life. It was hell. They made me a communication board, but it was so little and I wobbled so much that when I got function I could point, I couldn't point at it. So I'd point out, I'm cold but I was hungry. So I'd get bombarded with blankets. I just felt, for ages, felt so trapped. I felt really demeaned and isolated and forgotten. I think it was really, really hard, particularly because I was a young stroke survivor. But at the initial stages, I didn't want to be associated with stroke myself. I felt very lost because I couldn't go backwards to my old job and my old life, but there was nothing to go forward to. I think it took me about a year of grieving before I could feel that, it does happen to young people and that it's even more important that is spoken about because people aren't aware of that. All I knew is that I'd been told that I'd make a good recovery. I was young, I was fit. Throughout my recovery, the physical and emotional progression was never balanced. It was all about my physical progression. I felt like I'd gone back to being a baby. Like I had my dad feeding me. My mum was taller to me. It was not what I ever imagined my life to turn out like. I think as a stroke survivor, finding that I was a burden on the carers and, when my mum or dad or any carer showed a glimpse of, they've obviously were finding it difficult. I hated that. I hated that I impacted their lifestyle. I think throughout that initial time to ensure that I stayed emotionally on track, it was really important. I think I found being around people, being around my friends, so I didn't feel like I missed out too much on that social. I didn't hang around with my parents too much. Probably 90% of my main group friends did not have any link with disability, had never had a person who survived a stroke before other than their grandpa. I found that it was my role to tell them how to react and that it was okay for them to open up to me. I knew it was my role to make it easier for them. I wanted to try and sound stupid but elicit that grieving. Like I wanted to go, it's okay not to know. During rehabilitation, I think I had weekly psychology. But at that point in my recovery, I couldn't speak. So I would often be wheeled up to her room and I remember just sitting there and I felt I was really not anti, but just really, I was like, what is the point of being here? Because all I can do is sit here and listen to her talk, saying that she understood, and I just wasn't in that mindset. I just think that that feeling of acknowledgement is so, so important. And I often say that to therapists that, that rapport building is crucial to any relationship that you have with that patient. In the initial stages of my recovery, I was offered antidepressants, as I thought, there were times in my rehabilitation that I was like, I'm lacking energy and motivation to do this. But I think it was, for me, it wasn't that I was feeling like I needed medication. It was a grieving, it was a normality. But I think a lot of the health professionals saw that as something medication could fix and they could move on to the physical side. It wasn't until I started to do things again and do new things that I guess highlighted my strengths and not my weaknesses, and I practiced that I guess had a new identity. I wasn't the old Em anymore. I had a new direction. And I could see how it was so, so difficult for me to hear my mum or carer say to me, "Oh, I saw a glimpse of the old Em." And I knew that I couldn't meet that expectation. She was gone. So I was dealing with their denial, and when I in a way accepted that as hard as it was, she wasn't going to come back. My life is full of meaning now, which once it lacked. I had nothing. I've nothing but the deficits that I'd acquired from stroking. I could easily have gone a different path. I guess I'm not looking like I used to as at the future. I don't know what will happen. I just know that right now I'm content with where things are going.
Emma had been probably the fittest of all our children. She was really healthy, and she was an occupational therapist working with stroke sufferers. It was something out of the blue that we couldn't even fathom that this could have happened, that it was a congenital thing in her brain. She'd had it since she was born. We thought, what is going to be the result for Emma? We don't know whether she's going to wake up. When she wakes up, will she be able to move? Will she be able to speak? That made me feel incredibly sad and incredibly anxious. She was still in hospital, she was still in intensive care, but she was awake sometimes, alert sometimes, and had shocking nightmares. I think that was the most awful thing, to watch her afraid. We'd go back from the hospital and we'd sit and we'd write on the computer to a huge group of people. Later on, I put all those Emma updates into an album for Emma with photos, with the little band that she wore. I thought it would be good for her to know what happened in those 8 days. It was a blank for her. I didn't think that Emma would still be on a frame 5 years later. It didn't really enter my head that she would, and in fact I didn't think she would be in Royal Talbot for 5 or 6 months as she was. I thought she'd have a couple of months there and gradually she'd get better and better. So we became more and more realistic the more time we spent with Emma. But I always used to say to her, and it probably wasn't helpful, you're looking like the old Em. You know, you just look like the old Em, and Em hated that. And I could see why, because she wasn't the old Em, and she knew she wasn't going to be the old Em. And in fact, I loved the new Em a whole lot more. When I learned to understand that this Em wasn't going to be the same as the old one, then I settled a bit more. I didn't have to make her better.
Just to keep them clean.
I would imagine that I cried every day. Every day, at least once. I'm good at crying, so I'm glad I could cry, because other people I know in situations like that can't. And I had wonderful friends. Sometimes I felt very selfish, because when I was with my friends, it tended to be all about me. They would ask me about how I was and how Emma was, and I felt like I wasn't in the real world. It was all about us all the time, and I wanted to talk about normal things. I wanted to just do normal things, and there weren't a lot of normal things at that stage that I could do. I didn't ever go to a counsellor or anything like that, and neither did my husband. We had such a supportive family and such a supportive group of people around us. I don't really believe we needed to. I have a garden, and I absolutely love my garden, and that was a real help to me. It was therapy, and I would get out in the garden and just pull out weeds and cut things back. I also learned to swim, which I've never done, and at the beginning I used to take Emma to swimming and get everything out of the car and get her in there, and then I'd go and I'd think, now while she's swimming, I've got an hour, I'm going to race down, I'll do this and this and this. And then I thought, no, I know what I'll do. I'll stay there and I'll swim myself. And at first I swam right near Emma, and that's not what she wanted, and it wasn't good for me. So I went down to the other lane right at the other end of the pool and tried not to even be anxious about her, but just swim myself. It's not helpful just to keep busy all the time, and I think I did that in the beginning. I tried to fill up every minute with running, and I needed to sit. Some of the things people said were very unhelpful. People who say, oh, look, my grandmother had a stroke and it's awful and I know what you're going through. People who say, I know what you're going through, I would never say that to anyone, because nobody knows what anyone else goes through. Everybody's situation is different. We didn't want people ringing us. We knew that they cared, but we couldn't cope with telling this story or talking about it. Or people who would say, I hope you're looking after yourself, but never in any way try to see how they could help you. You know, some people would just bring a meal or pop some flowers on the step or leave a note in your box. That was the best thing. I think one of the hardest things for me has been feeling that I've got to divide myself up into so many pieces. I've got to give a big amount to Emma, and I want to do that, and I love doing that, but it means there's only so much left. We had 3 grandchildren last year from the other 3 kids in 9 months. So I want to be there for them as well. Hi, Em.
Hey.
No, well, do you want me to put him away while you eat it, Em?
No, it's go.
I have a lot of trouble not controlling Emma, and I'm learning not to do that, but I kind of think it's easier for me if I come in and see that there's stuff all over the sink. It's better that I can do it so quickly. Just put them on the bench, Hayne. You can put them where you want. Yeah. There's a balance that you have to get between letting her get on with things and knowing that she can, but at the same time making it easier for her, because it's so hard. Take it home, put some on.
Yeah, if you have time, that would be good.
Okay. Probably the biggest emotion we feel at the moment is pride in Emma, because people have got to know her and she doesn't lie down and put the blankets over her head each morning. She gets up and she says, I know I've got to swim. French name or
That
you have to do different things for them, but and encourage them and encourage them in the things they want to do. You don't have to save them. Like you have to respect them and make sure they keep their dignity, which I didn't at the beginning.
Depression and emotional reaction is very common after stroke. Some of the changes in mood might be caused by the stroke and the effect on the brain, and so perhaps some of the depressed mood or the decrease in motivation, which is common in depression, is a direct effect of the stroke. And some people get a fluctuating mood, which may be a direct effect of the stroke. The very common emotional reactions, of course, are to do with the adjustment of this huge event that's happened. It's important not to make judgments too early on about how things are going to be. But as time goes on, it can become apparent to people that, yes, they will have significant losses, things that they were able to do, they're no longer able to do. So for some people, this will be a very physical thing. They're no longer able to walk as briskly or walk well or even walk. Certainly not able to work. Distinguishing whether a person is depressed in stroke can be a bit difficult, because the common ways that depression is expressed is through emotional, that is sadness and being depressed. People with stroke have physical effects in their body, so they move slowly and could look depressed. People who get depressed lose motivation for things, so their drive is diminished. And of course there are physical effects of reduced appetite and sleep disturbance, which are common in depression as well. Those things can be evident in stroke. Sometimes we think, is that just the stroke? But that should not be assumed. An important part of adjusting to a life event like a stroke is to adjust to the giving up of what perhaps you were previously doing or previously hoping for. Readjusting in the sense of discovering a new life, discovering what my abilities are and what I am able to do. And life goes on, it's just different. Productive work, which is very important for all of us in our sense of self-esteem, can change, but finding something that is useful and meaningful to do is very important. We know that if a person is depressed, their outcome, their recovery, their level of functioning is severely impaired. And so depression impacts on motivation for rehabilitation, motivation for getting up in the morning, motivation for engaging with life, and treating depression is very important in stroke.
Oh, hi Max, it's Tracy. How are you going?
In the first instance, it's important to acknowledge it and to talk to people. Just being able to express to another person the difficulties you're having, the frustrations you're having, is important. I think there are a number of reasons why we, when we're in these sort of circumstances, don't talk to others, talk to family or talk to doctors. One is that we might feel we're burdening other people. We can feel ashamed that, we should be coping with this.
Sometimes we think that the other person, say the GP, has not got time to hear this, or that's not his or her job, that they're just involved in my physical care, and that's important not to think that. Care of the whole person is very important. Some people are unable to communicate clearly, and that could be they have something they want to say but can't put it into words, or sometimes they can't even form the words in their mind, and that's very frustrating, and if you can't communicate with people around you. The GP is a person who a patient or their carer can very reasonably expect support and help from and should talk to. There are support groups, that is, groups of people who have gone through similar experiences, and that can be very encouraging and supporting to see how other people have coped. Counselling can be very important, cognitive behavioural therapy, in some cases medication. Antidepressant medication is effective in treating depression in patients with stroke. It's important to think about the effects on a carer, that is the person who's closest to the person with a stroke, because the impact on them is enormous, and maybe we could say just as enormous as for the person with a stroke, because their life is really turned upside down.
Oh, Emma, does this go any higher?
And as well as the emotional coping, there is the daily grind of doing the things that need to be done, in this case for care, additionally for caring for the person who needs help. That is a major task for people going through these sort of crises, both to cope with the emotional side of things, but to cope with the practical day-to-day things. Clearly the task of recovery is a shared task that is shared by the patient, their carer, and also the professionals. I think it's important to be realistic about that and to understand what the caring role is. And it can be very difficult if the patient, the person with the stroke, is struggling to get motivated. It's very hard for another person to be able to get them doing things, and that's why it's so important that the whole team, the health professionals and family, are all involved.
Put your groceries up here.
Being a carer can be a real drain on the person, both physically and emotionally. It can lead to deprived sleep and poor eating, and in many ways self-neglect. So carers, it's a difficult task obviously, but carers do have to look after themselves, make time for themselves, get respite care if necessary to give themselves some time out. Carers can become depressed in real clinical ways that will impede their ability to do what they really want to do, which is care. And so they have to look after themselves and, in some circumstances, get help. And that help, as for anyone who's depressed, can be counselling and sometimes medication. After the acute crisis, life goes on, and it's important to think about engaging in life, and it helps recovery to start to think early about engaging in doing those things that bring pleasure. Some of the things that one did in the past may not be able to be done, but there are new things, and it's important to give oneself, both for the survivor and the carer, time doing pleasurable things, going out. It's important to realise that help is available, that depression can be treated and needs to be treated and should be treated, and there's a range of treatments of counselling, psychotherapy and medication that are readily accessible. Also, information and advice simply about depression and why people get depressed and what is depression can be very reassuring to people, and to understand that even though they are suffering, it's normal, and normal does not mean to be ignored, but it's a person is not going crazy simply because they feel stressed and depressed. Although we can seek professional help for counselling, we shouldn't split the care too much. Patients want to talk to their normal doctor who knows them well, understands their physical predicament and what's happening, about the emotional issues. And so doctors, physiotherapists, etc., should not be averse to just asking that question about how patients are going emotionally, and then directing them to care if that is required. It's important for health professionals to maintain hope. In these sort of situations, it's easy to be pessimistic, but both for the patient, but also for the health professionals, and to give patients and their carers some vision for an optimistic life in the future.